The mathematics were brutal and simple in late 1944. Commander David McCamble stared at his fuel gauge, showing less than 20 gallons remaining. He'd been airborne for nearly 2 hours during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. His ammunition counter read 0 across all 6 guns. Behind him, 9 Japanese aircraft were falling toward the Pacific Ocean, in flames. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Just 2 years earlier, American pilots were dying at alarming rates against the same enemy. But McCamble had just proven something that would change fighter combat forever. Let me take you back to where this story really begins. December 1941. Pearl Harbor exploded the Pacific into war. The U.S. Navy's frontline fighter was the F6F Wildcat, a stubby, underpowered machine that faced an enemy aircraft that seemed impossible. The Mitsubishi A6M0 could turn tighter than anything in the sky. It climbed faster. It had range that defied physics for such a light airframe. Worse, it was flown by veterans, not fresh academy graduates, men who'd honed their skills over China. Pilots with thousands of hours and dozens of kills. Saburo Sakai, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa. Names that struck fear into American squadron ready rooms. The early carrier battles showed the deadly mismatch. Coral Sea in May 1942. Midway, a month later. Wildcat pilots had courage in spades. But courage doesn't overcome a 35-knot speed disadvantage when you're chasing bombers. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, American pilots watched helplessly. Zeros sliced through their formations. They exploited every moment of hesitation. The loss rates were staggering. Some squadrons lost half their pilots in a single engagement. If the Zero could dictate the terms of engagement, American pilots would keep dying. Squadron commanders sent increasingly desperate reports back to Naval Air Station Patuxent River. They needed more than incremental improvements. They needed a fundamental shift in capability. Every fighter pilot who survived their first few combat missions learned the Thatch Weave. Named after Lieutenant Commander John "Jimmy" Thatch. He developed it out of sheer desperation in early 1942. The maneuver was brilliant in its simplicity. 2 fighters would fly as a mutually supporting pair. When a Zero latched onto one pilot's tail, his wingman would turn hard toward him. The attacker trying to follow would suddenly find himself flying into the guns of the second Wildcat. It worked. It saved lives. But it was fundamentally defensive. A way to avoid getting killed rather than a method for winning. Thatch himself understood this limitation. After Midway, in June 1942, he wrote in his after-action report, "The tactic was a last-ditch defensive measure, not a blueprint for air superiority. The problem was geometric. The weave required both pilots to abandon pursuit of enemy bombers. They had to focus entirely on survival." Meanwhile, Japanese bombers continued toward American carriers. Every second spent in defensive maneuvers was a second that enemy Vals and Kates got closer. They got closer to putting torpedoes into flight decks. By mid-1943, Navy squadrons had accumulated dozens of defensive tactics. The high-side perch, the rolling scissors, the Lufberry circle, an entire vocabulary of survival techniques. Pilots studied them religiously at fighter training schools in Miami and Jacksonville. But tactical officers analyzing combat reports saw a disturbing pattern. American fighters were achieving roughly even exchange rates with Zeros. 1 for 1. Maybe slightly better on good days. That wasn't nearly good enough. The United States was outproducing Japan in aircraft by massive margins. But you can't win a war trading aces for aces, veteran for veteran. Japan started the war with roughly 3,500 highly trained carrier pilots. The U.S. needed to kill that experience base faster than Japan could replace it. Now let me show you what changed everything. The USS Lexington's flight deck was organized chaos on August 31, 1943. Deck crews scrambled around a new fighter that looked almost brutish. Compared to the sleek Japanese Zeros it would face, the Grumman F6F Hellcat seemed massive. For pilots strapping into those cockpits, this wasn't just another aircraft. It was a lifeline. The Hellcat that rolled off Grumman's Bethpage, New York assembly line in late 1942 was the Navy's answer. A fighter with a massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney R-2800 engine, 6 50 caliber machine guns, an airframe that could absorb punishment that would shred a Zero. But here's what nobody fully understood as those first Hellcats launched into combat. Raw performance specs don't win dogfights. The Hellcat was faster, true. It could dive away from trouble. It had armor protection that felt like flying a bank vault compared to the Wildcat. But it was heavier, less maneuverable. Still facing those same veteran Japanese aces who'd been perfecting their craft for years. The question that haunted every Navy tactician wasn't whether the Hellcat was better than the Wildcat. It was whether it was good enough to beat the Zero. And more importantly, whether American pilots could figure out how to use it before casualty lists grew even longer. Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare noticed it first during a scramble in February 1943, months before he'd die in a night combat mission over Tarawa. Climbing to intercept a Betty bomber formation at 18,000 feet, he pushed his F6F into a steep climb. He realized something that Wildcat pilots could only dream about. He was still accelerating. The Hellcat's R-2800 engine didn't just provide power. It provided excess power, energy that could be converted into altitude or speed at the pilot's discretion. O'Hare's combat report mentioned almost casually that he'd maintained climb performance throughout the engagement. That single observation would eventually rewrite fighter combat doctrine. The physics branch at Naval Air Station Patuxent River started receiving unusual requests in January 1944. Squadron commanders were asking specific questions about dive performance, terminal velocity calculations, structural load limits at high speeds. These weren't theoretical inquiries. Pilots returning from combat were reporting that Zeros couldn't follow them in vertical maneuvers. Not wouldn't, couldn't. The Zero's lightweight construction gave it legendary turning ability. But that same feature became a fatal weakness. Above 350 knots indicated airspeed. At those speeds, control surfaces would stiffen dangerously. Several Japanese pilots had actually torn wings off trying to follow Hellcats into high-speed dives. Testing Officer Lieutenant Commander William Dean ran systematic trials through March 1944. He quantified what combat pilots were discovering instinctively. A Hellcat at 15,000 feet could accelerate to 425 knots in a vertical dive. That's roughly 490 miles per hour, while maintaining full control authority. Dean's team discovered the aircraft could pull out of these dives starting as low as 3,000 feet. With proper technique, the maneuver generated approximately 5.5 Gs, right at the edge of human tolerance, but well within the Hellcat's structural limits. The aircraft was rated for 7.5 G positive loads. Compare that to the Zero's approximately 5 G limit. You had a fighter that could maneuver in three-dimensional space that enemy aircraft literally couldn't enter without breaking apart. More importantly, Dean's testing revealed climb performance that changed tactical thinking. From sea level, a Hellcat could reach 10,000 feet in just under 4 minutes at combat power. That meant a pilot could execute a high-speed diving attack, convert his excess speed back into altitude, and be ready for another pass before the enemy formation could reorganize. It was energy management in its purest form. Potential energy becoming kinetic energy, becoming potential energy again. A cycle that Japanese fighters couldn't match because their engines simply didn't produce equivalent horsepower. Commander Jimmy Flatley, leading VF-5, started incorporating these findings into training syllabi by April 1944. His pilots practiced what they called yo-yo maneuvers, diving attacks followed by steep climbs, never staying at the enemy's altitude long enough to get trapped in a turning fight. Flatley's innovation was recognizing that altitude wasn't just a safety margin, it was ammunition. Every 1,000 feet above your opponent represented stored energy you could convert into attack speed. And the Hellcat's engine meant you could replenish that altitude faster than the enemy could climb to challenge you. The reports coming back from Flatley's squadron showed a dramatic shift. Kill ratios were climbing past 10 to 1. Not because pilots were better shots, but because they were taking shots the enemy couldn't return. They were fighting a completely different war. One fought in the vertical dimension where American engineering superiority finally mattered more than Japanese pilot experience. But the real proof came during the largest air battle in naval history. June 19, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. What pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Commander David McCamble was not a man prone to recklessness, which made his combat report from that day so startling. Leading Air Group 15 off the USS Essex, McCamble didn't just dive on a Japanese formation, he dove through it. His aircraft entered from 24,000 feet at a 70-degree angle. He passed vertically through a formation of Judy dive bombers escorted by Zeros, fired on 3 separate aircraft during the descent, pulled out at 8,000 feet, and was back at 20,000 feet before the Japanese pilots fully registered what had happened. He'd converted the dogfight from a swirling melee into a shooting gallery, where he controlled every parameter of engagement. The technique that would become known as boom and zoom wasn't invented on June 19th. German Luftwaffe pilots had used similar tactics against less maneuverable Russian fighters, but American naval aviators refined it into something surgically precise. The geometry was simple, but the execution demanded split-second timing. A Hellcat pilot would position himself 5,000 to 8,000 feet above enemy formations, ideally with the sun behind him to mask his approach. Then came the dive. Not a gentle descent, but a near-vertical plunge that built speed to over 400 knots. The pilot had perhaps 2 seconds in the firing envelope, just enough time for a 1-second burst from all 6 50-caliber guns. That's roughly 80 rounds total. But at a closing speed of 600 feet per second, it was like firing into a stationary target. What made this revolutionary wasn't the dive itself. Pilots had been making diving attacks since World War I. It was diving through the formation and continuing downward rather than trying to pull up and dogfight. Lieutenant Alex Vraciu, flying as McCamble's wingman, described it in his debriefing. You're passing through their altitude so fast they can't track you. Their instinct is to turn toward the threat, but you're already 5,000 feet below them before their turn is complete. And if they try to follow you down, their aircraft starts coming apart around 380 knots, while you're comfortable at 420. Over 2 days, June 19th and 20th, American Hellcat pilots shot down approximately 550 Japanese aircraft, against losses of only 29 American planes. That's a 19-1 kill ratio, numbers that seemed impossible just a year earlier. McCamble himself shot down 7 aircraft in one mission on the 19th, each engagement lasting less than 3 seconds of actual combat. His gun camera footage showed the same pattern repeatedly. A dive so steep the camera could barely keep the target in frame. a brief moment of tracer fire. Then the view pitching skyward as he converted speed back into altitude. The tactic solved the fundamental problem that had plagued American fighter pilots since Pearl Harbor. You couldn't outturn a Zero, so don't try. You couldn't outclimb from equal altitude, so start higher. And most importantly, you never fought at the enemy's preferred altitude or speed. Commander John Crommelin, analyzing the Philippine Sea results for SINCPAC, wrote in his tactical summary, "We have stopped fighting the Zero's fight. We now force the enemy to fight at energy states where their aircraft advantages become liabilities." By summer 1944, the transformation was complete. Hellcat squadrons weren't just winning. They were systematically dismantling Japanese air power using physics as their primary weapon. Let me show you exactly how the physics worked. The math behind a 60-degree dive attack tells you everything about why it worked. When a Hellcat rolls into a dive at that angle, gravity is contributing roughly 87% of the force pulling the aircraft downward. The engine is almost secondary. The pilot isn't forcing the aircraft to dive. He's allowing it to fall with purpose. At 15,000 feet, a Hellcat in a full combat dive would accelerate past 400 knots in approximately 18 seconds. That's adding nearly 230 miles per hour to whatever speed you started with. For a Zero pilot watching from below, that translates to a threat approaching at roughly 680 feet per second. The human eye can track movement, but the brain needs time to process threat vectors and formulate responses. That processing time is roughly 0.7 seconds for threat recognition and basic reaction. By the time a Japanese pilot's hand started moving toward his control stick, the Hellcat had already closed 476 feet and was entering gun range. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine was the critical component that made extreme dive attacks survivable and repeatable. This wasn't a delicate, high-revving power plant. It was 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, displacing 2,804 cubic inches, producing 2,000 horsepower at takeoff power. But raw horsepower was only part of the equation. The engine could maintain full power output at altitudes up to 17,000 feet thanks to its 2-stage supercharger. That meant a Hellcat pilot climbing back out of a dive attack at 10,000 feet had nearly the same power available as he did at sea level. Japanese radial engines, particularly the Nakajima Sakai that powered the Zero, lost power progressively with altitude. By 15,000 feet, a Zero had shed nearly 25% of its sea-level horsepower, while the Hellcat was still operating at peak performance. The airframe itself was deliberately overbuilt. Grumman's engineers had studied early combat damage reports from Wildcat squadrons. They made structural strength a primary design goal. The Hellcat's wing structure could handle 7.5 weight, G positive loads and 3G negative loads. Those numbers sound abstract until you understand what they mean in a vertical dive recovery. Pulling out of a 60-degree dive at 420 knots generates approximately 5.3 Gs if you start the recovery at 4,000 feet. That's enough force to drain blood from your brain toward your legs, graying out your vision, making your arms feel like lead weights, pressing you into your seat with over 800 pounds of force. Pilots described it as trying to breathe with an elephant standing on your chest. But the aircraft could handle significantly more. The wing spars were forged aluminum, not weight-saving bent sheet metal. Control surfaces had metal skin rather than fabric covering. When you pulled back hard on that stick at 400 knots, the Hellcat responded predictably. Compare that to the Zero's reported structural limits, approximately 5G maximum before risking catastrophic failure. Japanese test pilot Saburo Sake wrote after the war that diving through 350 knots made the stick feel like it was embedded in concrete. High-speed pullouts generated control forces that were borderline unmanageable. Several Zero pilots died in 1944 attempting to follow Hellcats into vertical maneuvers. Their aircraft literally disintegrated from structural overload. American intelligence reports documented at least 9 separate incidents where captured Zero wreckage showed wing failure, consistent with excessive G-loading during dive recoveries. Terminal velocity for a Hellcat in a straight vertical dive was calculated at around 550 knots, though operational doctrine wisely limited combat dives to 450 knots maximum. That still provided overwhelming advantages. The tactical implication was brutally simple. Structural strength translated into options. A Zero pilot watching a Hellcat commit to a dive faced an impossible choice: follow and risk structural failure, or let the American escape and reset the engagement at his preferred altitude. Lieutenant Commander Paul Holmberg summed it up in his June 1944 training document. "We're not outflying them. We're out-engineering them. Their pilots are still probably better in pure stick and rudder skills, but we've created a regime of flight where their skills don't matter." The psychological impact was devastating. The psychological impact of vertical attacks shattered something fundamental in how Japanese pilots understood air combat. Since the opening days of the war, Zero pilots had been trained in a doctrine called Sento Kyote, combat maneuvering that emphasized tight turns, energy conservation through efficient movement, exploiting the Zero's superior agility. Every engagement began with the assumption that combat would occur in the horizontal plane, with victory going to the pilot who could position himself on an enemy's tail through superior turning. When Hellcats started appearing from directly overhead at speeds that seemed physically impossible, it violated every assumption Japanese pilots had spent years internalizing. Captured documents from late 1944 showed Japanese instructors struggling to develop counter-tactics. One manual, translated by Navy intelligence in November 1944, instructed pilots to maintain constant vigilance above and to never assume the sky above 5,000 meters is empty. That sounds like reasonable advice until you understand what it demands. A pilot engaged in combat operates on cognitive bandwidth. There's only so much your brain can process while flying at 300 miles per hour, monitoring instruments, tracking multiple aircraft, managing your own energy state. Forcing pilots to constantly check above them meant dividing attention that was already stretched thin. And even if you spotted a Hellcat at 20,000 feet, what exactly were you supposed to do about it? You couldn't climb fast enough to challenge him before he dove. You couldn't maintain a defensive weave indefinitely while still attacking American bombers. The attacks from above also exploited a basic limitation of human vision and situational awareness. The human eye's effective field of view is roughly 120 degrees horizontally, but only about 90 degrees vertically. And that's when you're deliberately looking up. When you're focused on threats at your altitude, where every previous combat engagement had occurred, your effective vertical awareness drops to perhaps 45 degrees. Hellcat pilots learned to initiate dives from positions that were literally outside the enemy's visual range until it was too late. Commander Charles Stimson, leading VF-11, described it as hunting from a hide. You were invisible until the moment of attack, and by then the geometry made evasion nearly impossible. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who survived the war and wrote extensively about his experiences, described the tactical hopelessness. After an engagement in October 1944, where his formation lost 6 aircraft to Hellcats without downing a single American fighter, he wrote, "We could see them above us, sitting there like hawks. We knew they would dive. We knew we could not follow them when they did, and we knew that when they climbed back to altitude, they would dive again. We were not fighting pilots. We were fighting gravity, and you cannot outmaneuver gravity. That sense of helplessness was exactly what American tacticians had been trying to create. By mid-1944, training syllabi at Maui and Kahului were explicitly teaching pilots to maximize the psychological impact of vertical attacks. Instructions included using cloud cover to mask your altitude position, timing attacks to coincide with moments when enemy formations were most vulnerable, always maintaining enough energy to climb back to attacking position. The goal wasn't just to shoot down aircraft. It was to make Japanese pilots understand that every second they stayed airborne, there could be a threat above them they couldn't see and couldn't counter. Flight operations data from Japanese carriers in late 1944 showed a measurable decline in aggressive tactics. Pilots were becoming more defensive, more hesitant, spending more time checking their 6 o'clock and their 12 o'clock high. They were being hunted, and they knew it. Now, let me take you back to October 24th, 1944. October 24th, 1944, started like any combat day for Commander David McCamble. Pre-dawn briefing, weather check, aircraft inspection. What it became was a single mission that would validate every tactical innovation of the previous year and produce the most lopsided individual combat performance in American naval aviation history. McCamble and his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, launched from USS Essex at 7:30 hours. Their mission: provide combat air patrol over the American fleet during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. What they encountered was a Japanese strike package of roughly 60 aircraft: Judy dive bombers, Jill torpedo bombers, Zero escorts, all heading directly toward the invasion fleet. McCamble didn't attack immediately. He climbed. He took his two-plane section to 23,000 feet, positioned himself between the enemy formation and the sun, and watched. He was waiting for the Japanese fighters to commit, to drop their external fuel tanks and engage other American fighters at lower altitudes. When roughly half the Zero escorts descended to engage VF-27 at 15,000 feet, McCamble rolled into his attack. The first pass was textbook vertical doctrine, a 65-degree dive that built speed to 415 knots, a 2-second firing pass that sent one Judy spiraling downward trailing smoke, then a 4,000-foot pullout that generated over 5 Gs and sent him rocketing back upward. He was back at 20,000 feet in 45 seconds. The Japanese formation scattered. This was the other advantage of vertical attacks that combat reports had documented but was harder to quantify: the chaos they created. When you're hit from the side or behind, your formation knows where the threat is. When something tears through your formation from directly above at 400 knots, nobody knows where to look next. McCamble's second pass came from a slightly different angle, hitting a group of bombers that had turned west trying to evade. Another Judy destroyed. Third pass, a Zero that tried to climb to challenge him, but was still 3,000 feet below when McCamble fired. The engagement lasted nearly 90 minutes. McCamble would dive, fire, climb, reposition, and dive again. Rushing stayed with him for the first 4 kills, then had to break off with fuel concerns. McCamble continued alone. By his 7th kill, McCamble's ammunition was running critically low. He'd fired over 2,400 rounds, approximately 400 rounds per gun. The Hellcat carried 2,400 total rounds, which meant he was operating on the last belt of ammunition per gun. His 8th kill came at around 10 hours, a Zero that he caught in a climbing turn. His 9th came 3 minutes later, another Judy that was so focused on reaching the American fleet it never saw the attack from above. When McCamble finally turned back toward Essex, he'd expended every round of ammunition and was running on fumes. His fuel gauge showed less than 20 gallons remaining. He'd been airborne for nearly 2 hours, most of it in combat power settings that should have emptied his tanks after 90 minutes. The mission made McCamble the Navy's top ace of the war. He'd eventually reach 34 confirmed kills, but more importantly, it demonstrated what the new doctrine could achieve. 9 aircraft destroyed, 0 damage to his Hellcat, and he'd done it essentially solo after rushing departed. The post-mission analysis by Air Group 15's intelligence officer noted that McCamble had maintained energy advantage throughout the engagement, never descending below 8,000 feet except during attack passes, never engaged in a turning fight. Every kill came from a position of overwhelming tactical advantage, higher, faster, attacking on his terms. The broader Leyte Gulf air battles produced similar results across the fleet. Over 4 days of combat, from October 23 to 26, Hellcat squadrons shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft, while losing fewer than 16 fighters in air-to-air combat. That's a 19-1 kill ratio, numbers that seemed impossible back in 1942 when Wildcats were struggling to achieve 1-to-1 exchanges. The doctrine worked. Vertical energy management, boom and zoom attacks, refusing to fight at the enemy's preferred altitude. It had transformed American naval aviation from desperate defenders into dominant hunters. But the story doesn't end in 1945. The vertical attack doctrine that Hellcat pilots perfected didn't end when World War II did. It became the foundational principle of American fighter tactics, encoded into training programs, passed down through generations of pilots who never flew a piston-engine aircraft. When the Navy established the Fighter Weapons School at Naval Air Station Miramar in 1969, the program that would become famous as Top Gun, the very first tactical manual included a section titled Energy Management in Vertical Maneuvering. The language was updated for jet aircraft. The speeds were doubled, but the core concept was identical to what David McCamble had proven over Leyte Gulf 25 years earlier. Maintain altitude advantage. Convert it to speed during attack. Refuse engagements where the enemy holds positional superiority. Korea provided the first test of these principles in jet combat. When F9F Panthers and F4U Corsairs faced Soviet-built MiG-15s starting in 1950, the performance mismatch looked disturbingly familiar to veterans who remembered facing Zeros. The MiG could outturn American fighters and had a superior climb rate at high altitude. But Navy and Marine pilots had institutional knowledge that the newly formed Air Force was still developing. They fought vertically. Lieutenant Commander William Amon, a former Hellcat pilot flying Corsairs off USS Philippine Sea, shot down 2 MiG-15s in January 1953. Using tactics he explicitly described as identical to what we used in 44, just 200 knots faster. Dive from altitude. Use speed to compensate for the enemy's maneuverability advantage. Never stay at their preferred fighting altitude. The doctrine's influence became even more apparent in Vietnam. Early in that conflict, from 1965 through 1967, Air Force F-4 Phantom pilots suffered embarrassing loss rates against smaller, more maneuverable North Vietnamese MiG-17s and MiG-21s. The problem wasn't the aircraft. The F-4 was faster and more powerful. The problem was doctrine. Air Force pilots had been trained primarily for high-altitude interception of Soviet bombers, emphasizing radar-guided missile attacks. When forced into visual range dogfights, they tried to turn with MiGs, exactly the mistake Wildcat pilots had made 25 years earlier. Navy F-4 crews, drawing on institutional knowledge preserved through Hellcat veterans who had become instructors, maintained significantly better kill ratios. By fighting vertically and managing energy, this performance gap directly led to the creation of Top Gun in 1969. The curriculum explicitly studied World War II Pacific combat reports, particularly the tactical evolution from 1943 to 1945. Instructor pilots like Lieutenant Commander Dan Peterson, one of Top Gun's founders, required students to read after-action reports from Hellcat squadrons. The lessons were stark. Technology alone doesn't win dogfights. Understanding your aircraft's strengths relative to the enemy's does. Top Gun's famous fleet adversary program, where instructors flew smaller, more maneuverable aircraft against students in F-4s, was deliberately designed to recreate the Hellcat versus Zero dynamic. Students had to learn that trying to turn with the adversary was suicide. They had to use vertical maneuvers, energy management, positional advantage. The vertical attack doctrine's DNA appears in every modern American fighter tactic. The F-15 Eagle's entire design philosophy optimizes for fighting vertically and maintaining energy advantage. High thrust-to-weight ratio, phenomenal climb rate, powerful radar for long-range detection. The F-22 Raptor's Super Cruise capability, allowing sustained supersonic flight without afterburner, exists specifically to maintain the energy state advantage that Hellcat pilots called altitude bank. Even modern aerial combat training emphasizes the same principles Jimmy Flatley and David McCamble codified in 1944. The terminology has changed. Pilots now talk about rate fights versus radius fights and specific excess power. But the underlying physics is identical. What makes this legacy remarkable is how a tactic born from desperation became timeless doctrine. Hellcat pilots in 1943 were trying not to die. They discovered that their aircraft's strengths, properly used, could dominate an enemy that seemed superior. That insight transcended the specific aircraft and became the foundation of how America trains fighter pilots. Fight your fight, not theirs. Use physics as a weapon. Turn engineering advantages into tactical supremacy. Every aviator who's passed through Miramar, every F-16 pilot who's learned energy management, every F-35 driver who's studied vertical tactics is flying a doctrine refined over the Pacific Ocean 8 decades ago, by pilots who learned that sometimes the best way forward is straight down.